Hello and welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. I'm Humble and we're back on the Blunicorn again, this time doing some more rework on the engine and clutch. So previously I talked about the oiling issues and what we're going to do to fix them, but we're still waiting on parts, specifically the little plugs from Texas Speed to fill the displacement on demand holes in the upper valley, as it were, and that'll basically keep it from losing oil pressure. Today, we're going to be working on the clutch. So previously, we had tried to install the RPS triple carbon clutch. It gets rave reviews from just about everybody who uses it. It's commonly seen on very high horsepower twin turbo Corvettes, Porsches like 911, Vipers, etc., twin turbo or turbo Supras, very common in like drag use for manual cars. Just because the way that RPS does their carbon-carbon setup, it's a very smooth, streetable engagement, but it also has very high torque holding capacity. Ultimately, that's the clutch that I wanted in the car, but there was a bunch of issues installing it, which I'll get to later. For right now, what we need to do is pull off the kind of tried and true single plate clutch and get that back off of the motor and switch everything around again. So let's get on that.
Rays of light, we're moving through the night. With destiny in our sights, we've got to fight. Through all the rain, we're masking all our pain to take what still remains of our lives.
Okay, got the transmission here. Got our triple plate carbon flywheel in place. This is the RPS flywheel. Already got the bolts torqued down. Pretty simple job, done it before. But what I wanted to show you is the issues that I was having trouble with and why we're coming back to do this now. So the old clutch is there. Again, to recap, it's a single plate clutch. It's a super heavy duty pressure plate. This pressure plate is an upgraded unit for a twin turbo Porsche, like a Stage 2 or a GT2 aftermarket. It's super heavy duty, and it exerts about 1,050 pounds of force on the crank to disengage that clutch. The result, though, is that it holds a ton of torque. It holds something like 700 foot-pounds or 750 foot-pounds of torque, maybe a little more, which is, you know, pretty good for a single plate clutch that is that size. For reference, that's my hand. It's not very big. It's only, say, 8 inches or 8.5 inches or so. Coming back to the RPS clutch and the difficulties we were having, it was purely self-inflicted. And what was happening is, through all the ins and outs and the frustrations and just trying to get the car built as quickly as possible to meet our initial deadline, what would happen is these plates, or one of these plates, would be installed backwards. And there's 3 of them. So it might be the front plate, might be the last plate, might be the middle plate. And if you notice, we're looking at the back side here and it's flat around the edge. If I turn this disc over, there's a bevel which helps it slide onto the input shaft of the transmission much easier. What I would have to do is take each disc and slide it over and make sure that we have a good fit. So on this one, there's products that RPS supplies to brush any debris out of these little splines. And we used that. We cleaned up the input shaft. We greased it really well. But inevitably, one of these discs was backwards. And that's just, like I said, purely self-inflicted. Now, if you notice on the front of the disc, they're labeled. So each one of these discs has a label on it that faces the outside. So currently, this disc is on backwards. This label should be facing outward on the flywheel like that when you assemble it. And that makes sure that this bevel is facing outward to accept the transmission input shaft once everything is in place. What I've done is I double-checked the fitment of all the discs. I marked it with a paint pen just to be doubly sure that I've done each one and that each one faces outward, and this is the face that faces outward. And so what I'm trying to do is to make sure I don't make those same mistakes again, because I really, really want this clutch to work. So now what I'm going to do is get this thing put together and get it cinched on so it's ready to go.
We've justified our sin, and we're gonna take you on a ride till we find answers within. Location not here, in shadows we all disappear.
All right, fast forward a bit. I finally got the TSP plugs in, and I wanted to show you what they look like and how to install them. So I've just got one in my hand here, and as you can see, it's a little tapered plug with a bit of a step in the top of it. And what you do is you just tap these into place. I've sort of done the first one here just to get a knack for it, see how easy it was to install, and there's really nothing to it. Just very carefully put this plug into place, and it goes partially in, like about a third of the way in on its own. And then I've just got a brass hammer here, and you just tap it home. And then when you hear that tone change, it's very solidly in place. And that's all there is to it. There's just a minor interference fit so that these are just held in place with friction for the most part. And as you can see, they raise up a little bit, but there's no way they can come out, because once this cover is on, it'll keep those into place and then keep all these holes plugged up. So I'm going to go ahead and install the rest of these and then button up our valley cover, and that should take care of our oil pressure issue. Engine is almost all the way buttoned up. Basically what's left is to clean up the front of the engine and just sort of de-oil it from the dyno episode that we had, and clean up the belt and the pulleys, and again, just any oil residue that was on them from the last dyno session while the motor's out, get this all cleaned up. But I'm just going to do that off camera. I don't think you guys are really interested in that. And instead, I'm going to talk about what's next on the docket. And it might be a little controversial to some. So let me reach inside the chassis here, and we're going to have a little talk. What I want to talk about is, if I center up here, is this tube here and this tube here. Those are support tubes for our engine mount on either side. So our engine mounts to this pad here and this pad here. And by looking at it, you might think it's a stressed member, but it's not. Those mount to rubber pads that sit here on the side of the engine. So there is compliance built into that. It allows some movement to the engine, not a whole lot, but it's not a rigid mount like you would think. So the engine itself is not a stressed member in the chassis. And what I'm thinking about is removing this tube and this tube, which opens up a few possibilities. Now, the pros in this is that if I come to the side, when the engine is in the car, the exhaust wraps around this tube, and when you're taking off parts of it, it makes it very difficult to get it out. And that's the stock Ultima exhaust. So, like, these tubes here interfere with this chassis member. It's very difficult to, and actually kind of a puzzle, to worm those pieces into place. And sometimes it's just easier to remove the valve cover to get those in. Without that tube in place, everything slips in super easily. That also opens up the possibility for other aftermarket exhausts. I've seen on other cars, specifically Utimas most recently, where this tube was removed. Basically an aftermarket set of shoddy block hugger headers was used in the Ultima, and the exhaust outlet came out down here, and then the rest of the exhaust was down here next to where the transmission would be, and then straight out the back. It makes for an even shorter exhaust in the Ultima, which means freer flowing than the stock setup. It removes bends, so the stock Ultima has an S bend that comes up, and it would remove that entirely, which gets rid of some restriction as well. Not a whole lot, but there's some. And just having the ability to change my exhaust, or to get a better flowing exhaust, or fit something that runs down the side of the chassis, which will give me other options to mount stuff up here, up high, like an oil cooler or something like that, or to even route cooling air next to our exhaust, or between our exhaust and the transmission from underneath. There's plenty of options there, and it's something I've been thinking about for a while. Now, the downside is, does it potentially compromise the chassis in some way? I can sort of say yes, it does, but to what extent, that I don't know. If we look closely, this node on the engine mount is not evenly met. So every tube doesn't meet exactly in the middle. You can see there's kind of one down low, one in the middle, and then one up high. Does that really affect the rigidity? Yes, but I think you're splitting hairs. In this triangle, if we look at where the load would be going, any load that's pushing out on that guy, so from the chassis torsion or from the motor leaning over, it's attempting to put the load down this tube, down that tube, and up into this tube. Now, this point, we have multiple tubes meeting, and down in that point, we have multiple tubes meeting. But up here, while we have multiple tubes meeting, it's in the middle of a span, And yeah, there's larger tubing there as well, but I'm not convinced that that's actually giving us a lot of support. I won't say immeasurable, but it's so low that I think it's not detrimental to trim this tube out. Now, if anyone has put an Ultima chassis in CAD and run torsional tests with and without that tube, I would love to see. Or if somebody can do that, I would love to see the results. For the ease of use to install and remove the exhaust, and to open up the possibilities to having other aftermarket or non-Ultima specific exhausts, I think removing those tubes is worthwhile. Now, I said this might be controversial, modifying a chassis, but the way I see it is I'm not racing this car. I'm not winning money with this car. And anything that makes it easier to work on or easier from a maintenance standpoint is a quality of life improvement. And I've tried to make a lot of those with this rebuild, with the power steering, the front nose lift, and all that stuff. So anything that I can do to improve, or like I said, improve the quality of life or quality of ownership and maintenance on the car, I think is a big win. I'm gonna cut those tubes out, and when we get the motor back in, I'll demonstrate basically the ease of install when we put the exhaust back in. First up, what we need to do is get the engine out of the way and back the chassis out of the garage. And then all this stuff is exposed now, so I have a drop cloth that we need to put in place to keep debris out of all the open ports and holes that we see, as well as put some plugs into place just to make sure we don't get any external debris inside of our lines. So let's go ahead and get that going. Okay, fast forward again, and I got all the areas where we had cut and ground down painted, and then I've covered those areas in a new layer of our gold foil to both protect and hide our crimes. So now you can't even tell that anything was cut there. So what's left is we're gonna do a little bit of cleanup while we can reach everything in here. Both from the cutting and the oil and water adventures that we've had. Same with the front of the engine. We're going to clean that up and wipe down the belt and everything, make sure that's good. And then engine goes back in and the transmission goes back in. All right, so you saw us struggling with the clutch, and this is probably the 5th or 6th time that we've tried to install this. But now we've discovered why the transmission won't slide in, and it has everything to do with this plastic alignment tool. So if I put it in underneath and I align the discs, and let's just give them a little spin to make sure all the splines are aligned. If I carefully remove it, if you look down there all the way through, the splines don't quite line up. This is the last disc in the stack, the last one that the transmission has to go through, and the splines are just off a little bit. If you look there, it's a little easier to see. They're off just a hair. And what that means is that while the transmission slips somewhat easily through the first two, by the time it gets to the last disc, it clashes against these teeth, and you just can't get it in. So there's just so much play in this plastic tool, so much room for error. It's just impossible to get those discs aligned to get it installed. So currently we're kind of hurry up and wait. So we've got the engine in, we got everything else ready to go. I'm still waiting on baffling and filler for the mufflers on the exhaust. But now what I'm gonna have to do is try and source an actual 996 or 997 transmission input shaft that will properly align all three discs in the clutch in order to get the transmission installed cleanly, because it is just a bear to try and force that in. In fact, you don't want to force it in, because the moment you start forcing things is the moment you start breaking them. And we've had an issue with that before, munging up the teeth a little bit and having to straighten them out because of these alignment issues. And now we know the cause behind it. That being said, I think that's just going to do it for today. Unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to stop. Kind of a long one and a lot to cover, but a lot of it you've seen before. So hopefully next time I'll have a proper alignment tool and we can get the transmission put in. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.